It's not like the roller coaster that we have in Latin America, where one day everything is fine and the other day everything is terrible. In those countries like Sweden, Europe, States, everything is very stable and planned.
Hello, and welcome to the Auto Ethnographer. I'm John Stech, your host on this journey. We travel the globe to bring you stories about culture and the global automotive industry. Fasten your seatbelt and let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Auto Ethnographer. Today, we traveled across the globe to Brazil, Sao Paulo to be precise. We have a fantastic guest on the program today, Jorge Mussi. He is the general manager responsible for the customer service or after sales at Toyota in Brazil, responsible for over 300 dealers and all of the customer service activities that occur across this very large 220 million inhabitant country. George had previously, before joining Toyota, in fact, exactly 4 years ago, as we're recording this, he had a long career with Volvo cars, as well as Volvo construction equipment and trucks. He started about 32 years ago in Brazil with Volvo cars, and then transitioned over to Volvo truck and construction equipment for a very interesting reason, which he'll walk through in a few moments. His journeys then took him over to Sweden, where he spent several years working in Sweden, in fact, even picking up Swedish citizenship. He then headed back to Brazil, where he was responsible for customer service for the Brazilian market for Volvo cars, and ultimately then went to the United States for a second foreign assignment, where he then took on the responsibility for after sales across the entire Latin American market, as well as the Canadian market for customer service Volvo cars. He headed back down to Brazil about 5 years ago, just about the time that COVID took over the planet. But then, as I mentioned, he joined Toyota about exactly 4 years ago. With that, I would love to introduce Jorge Mussi. George, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, John. It's really and a big pleasure to be here with you. Well, my story starts back in 1992, John, when I joined Volvo Cars in Brazil after the Brazilian government decided to open up the country or the market for the importation of cars. Because until then, it was forbidden to import cars in Brazil. So there was basically the local national industry, and this industry was made of a group called a Big Four. There was only Ford, Volkswagen, General Motors, and Fiat. That was it. That was all that the Brazilian customers could choose. But then the Brazilian president, just elect Mr. Collor de Mello, he drove a Ferrari here at Fiat's test track down in Brazil, here in Minas Gerais. And when he did that, he said, our cars, our national cars, they look like carriages. And then he took the decision to open up for the importation of cars. And when that happened, the market was flooded by new imported brands that we didn't even know existed. And that was the moment back in 1992 when Volvo Cars decided to establish itself in Brazil. The Volvo operations for trucks was already established here since 1977 with a factory for manufacturing trucks and buses, right? But cars, no. So the importation of Volvo cars started back in 1992, and when the company, the national sales company, was being structured here, I was the third employee to be hired to work as a support technician. I mean, I would be responsible back then for supporting the dealer network to take care of the products. Whenever there was a problem, I was the last resource to solve the problem and help the dealer network to solve it. Basically, I was hired back then because I was just getting graduated on electronics engineering. And at the time, the Volvo products were really so much advanced for the status of the Brazilian market that was so closed with only four brands that they were no longer hiring people with graduation or education in mechanics. Instead, they wanted people from electronics to learn the mechanics in the daily operations or the by doing, right? So that's how I joined Volvo. I came from my internship at a company which was operating mainframes and the computer terminals, and I had a doctor's suitcase where I had computer parts inside, and I would go to the customers to fix their computers or their tape units.
Quite a jump though into automotive from there. I can understand the electronics component of that, and how advanced the cars must have seemed versus what was locally available on the market.
But the catch is that I used to on my hobby was to uh, to to mess with cars. So I was that kind of person that after work hours would go and totally dismantle my own car, dismantle the engine, upgrade it, turbocharge it from normally aspirated. I transformed it into a turbocharged engine, and so on. So I had the experience of the mechanical stuff from my own experience, right? But the education basically came with the electronics then.
So you spent a number of years working on the more technical customer service side with Volvo cars, but then you had that transition to the trucks and the construction equipment. Can you tell a little bit the story how what happened to passenger cars and the market in Brazil? Because there was really quite an interesting twist in the 1990s.
We started back in 1992, and then I was responsible first for as a support and repair technician to help the network. But as the years gone by, I started to be responsible also for the processing the warranty cases. Back then, I would send the warranty forms to Sweden to be processed, and then they would send or they would reimburse Volvo Cars Brazil on the amount of money that we would have spent on warranty. Then I took care also of the parts supply, the parts warehouse, and so on. And that was it. And then I became a training instructor back in 1995 because I had collected so much knowledge along from 1992 up to 1995 that I had to start teaching or being used as a trainer on the classroom in order to train the dealer network. But then um, Brazil is not exactly a very stable country, and then back then we were recovering from years of high inflation, and the Brazilian government at that year, 1996 approximately, they noticed that the trade balance in Brazil was in a tremendous deficit. So what happened is that they looked at the imported car market, and of course, after 20 years being unable to import any cars, the importation of cars was skyrocketing, affecting the trade balance. So back in 1996, they decided, oops, let's do something here. Let's increase the import taxes in 100%. So we went from 35% import taxes to 70% just overnight. In order, and the government did that in order to stop the importation of cars. And I remember back then we had like 2,000 cars already on the vessel going to Brazil, and when they would arrive in Brazil, they would have to pay double the taxes that they used to pay, which of course would affect customer or the final price, the retail price for the cars, right? So the decision of the company was not very complex. There was an exception for that. The government also uh, um, said that, okay, let's do like this. If you produce anything in Brazil and you export, for every dollar that is exported, you can import $1 without paying the increase of taxes. And then Volvo Cars decided, oops, wait a minute. There is an operation already established in Brazil for trucks and buses, which is exporting. Back then, they were exporting trucks cabin, and so on to Europe because they would use the cabins that were made in Brazil to produce trucks over there. And let's take advantage of those exports to import cars without paying the extra taxes. So the decision was very simple. Let's go and become a part of the Volvo Trucks group. And that was it back in 1996. We became a part of the Volvo Trucks group in Brazil. And on my side, what happened was that as I was the technical trainer or the trainer responsible for training the whole dealer network, I would be allocated inside the Volvo Trucks business in the training department. But the training department at the Volvo Trucks business would not only do trainings for cars, they would do training for cars, buses, construction equipment, trucks. And for me, becoming a trainer there, I would have to go and train people on all those four products. So with that, I had the experience of working for probably almost all divisions of the Volvo group in way or another, except for Volvo Finance Services. When I moved over there, I had to work with all those products. And then from 1996 up to 1999, I worked basically as a trainer, and then I became the training manager for Latin America. But then in 1999, there was another twist. The company was sold to Ford Motor Company, Volvo Cars. And we, of course, we had to separate from the Volvo group, and the company had to move over to São Paulo, where Ford Motor Company was based back then. But I decided to stay at Volvo Group in Curitiba back then and work with the Volvo construction equipment business. But after 1 year working for Volvo construction equipment, I realized that I still had gasoline on my veins, on my blood. And luckily, I had the chance back in July 2020 to, sorry, 2000, July 2000, I had the chance to go back to Volvo Cars and continue with them, now based off from São Paulo, right? Where I had the opportunity to go back to my old job, which was training manager and also a support and a repair technician, right, to the whole Brazilian network until 2002 when I was invited by the Swedish organization to move to Sweden and become a trainer over there.
So you worked for really a decade for Volvo, for a Swedish organization in Brazil. How did you find the matchup, between yourself, the Brazilian culture, and then working for the Swedish?
Brazil is a country of many contrasts, and one of them that you will find if you come over here is how the Brazilian, let's say, the Brazilian colonization or settlement was established. Basically, I was born in Curitiba, which is a very, I would say, a very European based immigration city, if you know what I mean. Made up basically of Germans, Polish, Italians, not many Italians. I would say it's most of them, of the immigrants that built up Curitiba, are German and Polish immigrants, right? And I was born there. I myself, I am also, my mother my mother and my grandfather. They were from Polish descent, and on my mother's side, her father was German. So uh, based on that, first of all, the culture in Curitiba was very much like European, so to speak, right? Besides, Curitiba is located, despite being in Brazil, is located at 1,000 meters over the sea level. So it's probably one of the coldest cities in Brazil for the Brazilian standards, which means also the weather is similar to what you find sometimes in Europe. So the whole culture, and I don't know if that's why Volvo chose Curitiba to be the place for their trucks factory. And when they established themselves there back in 1977, they had a very strong connection with the city, probably because of the culture of the city, which was very much connected to Europe, which was not hard, but also because they provided the local people with lots of opportunities for the economical development and for jobs, right? So I didn't find it difficult at all to join Volvo back then. For me, the culture was so natural that I didn't feel the, let's say, the cultural clash that you usually would.
It's interesting because I think 99% of people probably, when they think of Brazil, they think of Rio de Janeiro, they think of beaches, they think of sand and palm trees. They certainly don't think of 1,000 meters above sea level, cold weather, and I believe it even snows in Curitiba, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, when I was not regularly, but I remember when I was 3 years old, being in the snow, and actually I was very like cozy and warm in my bed, and my parents they took me off of my bed to take me out to take a picture in the snow outside, which was not very pleasant. If you know what, well, you and I, we are used to snow because we lived in cold countries, right?
So this was actually perfect training for you to then eventually move yourself and your family over to Sweden in the early 2000s. Can you tell us how that was? I mean, that was certainly a societal difference working and living in Sweden versus Brazil. Even if Curitiba was more European oriented, I'm sure there were some major changes that you had to encounter.
When we speak about the culture itself, of course, we had to adapt ourselves because one thing is working for a Swedish company in Brazil, another thing is working for a Swedish company in Sweden, where you have to get integrated to the society, to well, to a whole new lifestyle, I would say. But one of the most difficult things I would say was to get adapted to the darkness because, and that is something that I never experienced before, right? During winter time, you go to work at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, it's dark. And when you go back home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's dark because the sun rises at 9:30, and goes down by 2:30, 3 o'clock. So it's, I mean, this is one of the things that you have to get used. And that is something that you have to battle sometimes because in your mind, it can be depressing. Not for me because, of course, I had the opportunity to get in contact with my working colleagues during the day. And of course, during the day, you go and have lunch with your colleagues and so on. But if you stay home, it's impossible because, of course, it's you never see the sunlight.
Physically, that's and psychologically, that's a huge challenge. I experienced the same living in Moscow for 7 years, having the same type of daylight hours. Of course, in the summer, it's the opposite. It feels like you never lose the daylight.
I
So
had to put the blinds on my windows at home in Sweden because in the summer the sun goes down by like what 10:30 in the evening or even sometimes like 11 o'clock, but the sun is up again like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning.
the office environment, uh, Swedish culture, I believe there's a lot of consensus that happens in Sweden, correct? You have a lot of consensus management. You get together a group of people who are tasked with a particular project or decision making, and they do that on a consensus basis. Is that different from what you had in Brazil? Was that a change for you to get into this type of a consensus management?
That was a big change for me. Actually, I learned in Sweden that the decisions are made in the coffee machine, not in the meeting. The meeting is just a way to, let's say, officialize the conversations and all the work that was done when you had some time talking to the people and discussing and planning ahead. So basically, the consensus was established when you had all those conversations, when you had all those meetings. These are invisible things that you cannot imagine, and this is only possible to learn if you live over there and if you get integrated in the society, right? When I moved over to Sweden, I moved in November 2023, and then we had visitors coming from all over the world, right? And for that reason, the people at the office would speak in English with me for a few weeks until the visitors were gone by the end of December. But from December, they started speaking to me only in Swedish. And perhaps that was the best thing that happened to me, because I started an immersion in the Swedish language back in December 2023. After 4 months, I was speaking Swedish already. And when you speak the local language, then you get totally integrated into the decision making, the society, and everything. I mean, I can remember a lot of expats that were living in Sweden, and after 10 years, they wouldn't be able to speak. Well, of course, they knew how to say hello and goodbye in Swedish, but they were basically speaking English. They never got like fluent in Swedish. Of course, I understand that the speed of things is different. When you go there in a managerial position, you have to take decisions. You don't have to learn. You don't have time to learn the language. You just have to take decisions and use your English skills and so on. But definitely, getting or learning the local language is a tremendous advantage for your professional and personal development, and also the decision making. I think that was what helped me a lot.
Taking a loop back just to kind of close the topic, what is the Brazilian decision-making style? Is it more top-down, or how does that work in Brazil in contrast to what you experienced in Sweden?
It shifts from company to company. When I was working for Volvo in Brazil, it was more like a consensus, but the boss had the final decision. Now in Toyota, the boss has the decision. I mean, it's very much hierarchical, right? And it's a way that the things work, like based on how the culture works. So for me, it was much more of a discussion of a consensus in Sweden than it was in Brazil.
To a certain degree, Volvo did actually bring some of that consensus decision-making to Brazil as well, to a certain extent, but still matched up to the local culture.
Yes, exactly. And I believe that the local culture here, I don't know, maybe you know that, or John, by experience, probably this culture of the boss taking the decision probably is similar to the United States also.
So you had quite considerable time, actually, in Sweden, where you assimilated quite a bit, and it's impressive if you learned the language within the first 4 months. You were certainly quite fluent by the end of your period of time in Sweden.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was so very much, I would say, integrated, or I felt so Swedish that I applied for the Swedish citizenship. After 5 years living in Sweden, you can apply for the Swedish citizenship. I did that, and I was approved. And Sweden is a very straightforward country, or a very is a country where it's very simple to deal with things, right? I just downloaded the forms from the immigration website, fill it in, send my Brazilian passport, and then they check everything and see if I had lived in Sweden for 5 years, my level of knowledge of the Swedish culture, and so on. And then they send me back like just like a certificate, a diploma. Here is your citizenship, and that was it.
It seems actually really quite simple, not so bureaucratic.
Yeah, it is. It seems that it's simple, but all the work that is behind that happened for 5 years is much more complicated, right?
But then you returned ultimately back to Brazil. Was that something that you expected, or were you planning to return to Brazil, or was that something that was a little bit more unexpected? It just kind of happened from a decision at the company.
No, no. As I told you, well, I moved back in 2003. I moved over to Sweden to restart my career. Let's say like this, right? As a trainer, and then I worked my way up from a trainer to team leader of the trainers, then to manager of the technical training, then manager of the commercial training, and ultimately um, the manager of the business development training. And then when I was at that position, um, one fine day in December, a Swedish guy that used to work with me as an expat when we were living in Brazil, he calls me and says, George, you ever thought about going back to Brazil, moving back to Brazil? Well, I was I had been living in Sweden for almost 10 years already, right? And then it never crossed my mind to move back to Brazil. But the thing was, I was the manager of the business development department, as I told you, and things they I mean, this is one thing that we have to understand when we talk about these developed cultures, developed countries. Everything has a time to happen. Nothing happens. It's not like the roller coaster that we have in Latin America, where one day everything is fine and the other day everything is terrible. In those countries like Sweden, Europe, States, everything is very stable and planned. And from if we translate it into my career story, back then in 2011, I was the manager of the business development training. I looked at my boss. My boss was the director, and he was like 50. Back then, I was 38 years old. My boss was already 55, and he told me, "Oh, this is probably my last position before I get retired in 5 years and so on." And I said, "My God, how much will I wait until my career develops, right?" And then this call that I got from this Swedish guy who worked with me, asking me to return to Brazil, and more than that, the position in Brazil was to be the director of the after sales customer service department in Brazil, was the chance that I had to become a director only being 38 years old. I mean, I would take a step that would take me at least 5 or 10 years in Sweden. So I did that. I moved back to Brazil because this was a leap, a jump in time for me. It's like jumping into the future, 10 years ahead, to be the director of the customer service and after sales area here in Brazil. And that was basically the decision. No, not much to think about.
How much of a shock was it to return back when it was not really a planned, a planned decision? You had to reacclimate, and not to mention the fact that you ended up now in Sao Paulo, which culturally is also quite different from Curitiba.
When I moved back here, the roller coaster starts again. I moved over to Brazil. The automotive market here was booming. There was a lot of Chinese companies coming in. The import market, the imported cars market was going through the roof again. And after 6, 7, 8 months here, guess what happens again? The Brazilian government raises the import taxes again in order to stop the importation of Chinese cars. And then they put a quota system. And probably you remember from that time when we worked together that we were limited to sell an average of the last 3 years, and then we had to invest in R&D here in Brazil in order to get tax exemption benefits. It was very complex. But again, I left a very stable, planned country, a very nice standard of living economy to move over to the roller coaster again. But it was sunny at least, and it never snows. So, but yeah, it was kind of a shock to move back. But again, I took on the challenge, and this was part of the being here again. Once you take those decisions, you decide that you're gonna do your best, and I did my best again here. When I came here, Volvo was, according to JD Power, Volvo was like the worst company in customer satisfaction. And after 2 years of implementation of the lean manufacturing process, among other things here, we put Volvo in the first place of customer satisfaction, and we stayed over there for 5 consecutive years, which was a very much, which was a great thing to do because, of course, we uh, we gave the Volvo Brazilian customers what you call it solidity in the operations, because with the customer service or the after sales operations that were established here before, it was not that good. The customers were not buying cars because they didn't have the support that they needed. And once we put everything in its place and everything worked as it should be, also the sales for Volvo started to go through the roof again.
After spending almost a decade in Sweden, you must have brought something back to Brazil that was able to, be an advantage for you in Volvo Car Brazil. Is there anything that you noticed that you brought back, that you were able to communicate better with the home office in Sweden, or any other lessons that you learned?
Actually, everything, John. Everything that I brought back from Sweden made it possible to improve the Brazilian operations. Due to my relationship and knowledge with the head office in Sweden, it was very much like straightforward to decide on improvements on the parts importation logistics, get parts very quickly here to supply our dealers. Technically speaking, homologation of products to get the information in Sweden. Since I knew the departments, it was very easy to get information, put it here, and get our products certified, because Brazil requires local certification. They don't just accept the European certification to sell cars here. They require that the products are locally certified here. So everything that I learned in Sweden, in one way or another, made the business much easier here. And especially when it comes to customer satisfaction, back in Sweden, I was part of the group who created the Volvo Personal Technicians, or the Volvo Personal Service, which was actually based on the Toyota philosophy of the lean production system. And we did that. We created that back in Sweden, and then I brought it also to Brazil, which made it very easy to implement here. And since I had the channels or the communication with Sweden, it was very nice and easy to bring the Swedish instructors, the Swedish structure from there to Brazil, to make Brazil the first country that became certified with its 100% of the network certified in this lean production system in the workshops, which made it very quick to repair the cars and thus achieve number one satisfaction for on the after sales.
It sounds like that you brought back to the organization in Brazil, having those connections, the contact, and also understanding, how to talk to the team back in Sweden, right? How to convince them for support, and, how to appeal to them for that assistance. So you also, simultaneously were also responsible for the government relations, as I remember, in that role. Um, that must have been something interesting as well, because you described a, let's say, somewhat simple passport and citizenship process in Brazil. Excuse me, but in Brazil, you said it's like a roller coaster, and decisions are taken quickly by the government. That must have been quite a challenging role as well, to now have to also manage those relationships with the government and some of the regulations and so on that govern the automotive industry.
when I came back to Brazil, and there was this increase in import taxes requiring us to invest in research and development, having the quotas to import cars and so on. All of that required a lot of contact with the Brazilian government in order to communicate well with them and get all the approvals for the business that we had. And that's when the president of the by then president of the company came to me and said, "Hey, what about besides the chair of director of customer service, you take the chair of director of government affairs also?" And I said, "Yeah." Basically, uh, the reason was that it required so much technical knowledge to talk with the government in order to establish what would be the future politics for policies for cars safety, maybe also emissions, fuel consumption, and so on, that each and every company in Brazil would need to have a person responsible in charge for the government affairs. And that falls on me because of all the technical stuff. And then I conducted that for also for almost 5 6 years, constantly traveling to the district capital here, Brasilia, in order to meet with ministers, with the technical people responsible for setting up the legislation and the requirements for the automotive industry. And I'm quite proud to say that some of the suggestions that I made back then representing Volvo in terms of safety equipment today are a standard of the Brazilian automotive production, because we suggest them many years ago. Like today, it's compulsory here in Brazil to have airbags, ABS brakes, among other driving assistance items that we discussed and suggested back then.
A few years later, in I believe it was 2017, looking at your history, um, somebody came along, me, and asked whether you might be interested in taking on a completely different role, which was to be the director of after sales across all of Latin America and Canada. And this would require, of course, then moving your family to the United States. The office was located just outside of New York City. How was that? That was a big change in and of itself. Can you talk a little bit about your transition to the United States?
I'm glad to say that it was much closer to, culturally speaking, much closer to the Brazilian culture than it was when I moved to Sweden. Uh, the fact of getting to live in the States was much easier because of the openness of the people. I mean, it's a totally different way of speaking with people. I mean, in Sweden, you go to the grocery store, and the cashier would barely look at you or talk to you. And in the States, you go to the grocery store, or you go to the what you call it, drugstore, the pharmacy, and they even ask if you want more medication or how do you do and stuff like that. So they are very like open to talk. So the atmosphere was completely different. Besides, the United States is a much more open country. I mean, uh, you have much more like many more options for like going and visiting cultural stuff and doing very funny things with your family. So, I mean, it was much easier for us to move from Brazil to the States than it was in the beginning to Sweden.
How did you find work in the office? Again, a different environment, right? You started in Brazil. You have a more Brazilian leaning work style. In Sweden, we're really in the heart of the company with the Swedish work style. Now you're in the United States. You have a Swedish brand. How was that? Did you notice any, you know, idiosyncrasies or unusual ways of working in the U.S.?
In the US, what for me the most impressive is how strong the market and the company was in the US. I mean, And I remember that from the time when I was working in Sweden. We used to produce the training materials in Sweden, and we translated them to English. And we even asked if the Americas wanted us in Sweden to produce the materials in American English. We did that. We created only the American English separated from the British English when we produced the material. And still, the Americans rewrite every single book that we produced. So, the most impressive thing for me when I moved into the United States is that they do their stuff. They don't just absorb things that come from Sweden or from abroad. They will do everything their style. And it shows how strong the market is because, of course, back then, I believe that when you and I we worked there, the States was the biggest market in the world, with China in second place, right? But then after some years, China took over as the biggest market for Volvo. But I mean, due to the volume and the history of Volvo cars being the United States for so many years, they had such, for me, they had the conditions to decide on their own what to do or what not to do. Of course, sometimes you have to be aligned with Sweden and so on, but it was much more of an independent country within the Volvo organization. In Brazil, we had to strictly follow the Swedish guidelines, while in the States, you sort of make your guidelines.
Did you find that now working in the US in this regional office, right? The Americas office where, from Canada down to Argentina, everything was being run out of this office outside of New York. Did you find that there was now leverage to be able to make more adaptation to some of the other markets as well? So the US was often driving the requirements, as you said. Did you find then that the Americas was able to leverage that and do more adaptation, for example, for Brazil or for Canada, some of the biggest markets in the hemisphere?
We were able there because, of course, you, John, you had the responsibility to deliver the results, and together we will discuss and set up the guidelines for the whole Latin America and Canada, right? So I remember when we used to discuss the budget for the following year, that we would need to generate X revenue, X profit, and so on. And based on that, we would take the decision to go and talk to the markets and say, look, we need this and this and this, and this is your target. Let's work together here. What are the actions you're going to do in order to achieve the results? But the results that we must achieve is that.
It was certainly a challenge to manage or lead across this patchwork of countries. That brings up another interesting question for me, for you. So you worked in Brazil, you are Brazilian, and I think to many people, there's a kind of homogeneous feeling about Latin America, right? But the countries are vastly different from each other. Even the regions in Brazil are very different from each other, Curitiba to Sao Paulo. How was it to work across Latin America now? Because the Mexicans are very different from the Chileans, who are very different from the Brazilians and the Argentinians.
Dealing with Mexico, it's one kind of culture. You go there, and just as an example, um, you don't eat lunch at noon. At noon, you eat a very small amount of food or sort of a very small, I don't know, brunch or something, and then you will eat your lunch much later on, like 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And while I was there, I was starving by midday, by 12 o'clock, because we are used to having the breakfast 8 in the morning and then lunch at 12 and then the dinner at 6. It was totally different, right? Besides, the way of thinking of Mexicans is different from the way of thinking of the Argentinians, which is different from the way of thinking of the Brazilians. And more than that, if you think that Brazil is the only country who speaks Portuguese in the whole Latin America, and then you have another 34 countries speaking Spanish, but with their own dialects, and even sometimes the same word is not used in Argentina and in Mexico. I remember that the word for, well, we all know guacamole is not the same word in Mexico and Argentina. It's different, and it means different kinds of fruits, or even that. So it's, I mean, of course, it's totally intelligible. People will understand the Spanish from Mexico, from Argentina, from Colombia, although there are very interesting dialects and accents, but we will manage somehow to understand each other. But that's not the question. The question is that, for example, Argentinians, they are much more European oriented, while the Mexicans, they are very close to the United States and they think in a different way. So that was a challenge, but we overcome that by being flexible. But sometimes you have to be firm in the decisions that you take. And despite the fact that they think differently, we never tolerated like behavior that deviated from the company's guidelines.
So then at the end of this, you said this was a challenge really leading across these different cultures, but you tested yourself pretty significantly next. So at the conclusion of this particular role with Volvo, you had the opportunity to join Toyota. And this was for you a major cultural shift. You already alluded to it at the beginning of the podcast. Walk us through a little bit your experience of going into the Toyota environment, the Japanese culture, which is of course vastly different. And interestingly, there is, as I remember, a very large Japanese population in Brazil. Is there any influence that plays into this mix as well?
The Japanese immigration to Brazil started more than 100 years ago. So Brazil has probably the best the biggest Japanese colony outside of Japan. Only here in São Paulo, there are more than 120,000 Japanese or descendants of Japanese living here, right? But of course, they are spread all over the country. But here is, like I would say, is the epicentrum of the Japanese based in Brazil. There is a neighborhood here in São Paulo called Liberdade, which would be the equivalent of a Japanese neighborhood. When you go there, you will find all those typical stores and even restaurants and food and so on. But I mean, and that's why perhaps when I started at Toyota, I found so many Brazilian Japanese working over there, right? Um, and speaking of that, of course, they know the culture. For me, it was very much different from the culture that I used to have, but also Toyota back then when I joined them right in the middle of the COVID, the company was going through a transformation here in Brazil also. And this transformation required people with different experiences from outside the company to join the company to help the company adapt to the new times. And that was basically why I was hired. I was bringing to Toyota more of an external culture in order to contribute to them to better adapt to the local market. And of course, think about delivering the results among a lot of other things.
It was a really big shift in scale, right? Volvo compared to Toyota in Brazil is a completely different story. Can you talk a little bit about how that scale also impacted you?
When I left Volvo, we had 30, 31, 32 dealers. At Toyota, we have 308 dealers. So it's 10 times more. We used to sell 5,000, 6,000 cars a year at Volvo. We sell 200,000 cars a year at Toyota. The parts warehouse is we just finished the new parts warehouse that we have been building for the last 2 years at Toyota. It's made of 55,000 square meters for storage of parts, and the parts warehouse at Volvo was rented, and it was about 3,500 square meters. So the scale is totally different. The amount of money that you deal with it, the revenues, the profit, the volume, the customer database. I mean, the customer base we have only for the last 8 years, which is the base which we measure the retention, customer retention at Toyota. We talk about 1.4 million customers. Well, that compared to Volvo is like probably 20 times more or 30 times more. I don't even know the number, but it's much bigger. So the scale is much bigger, which means that I have a much bigger team also, made of 360 people. Back at Volvo, I had like probably 20, 30 people, something like that. So the scale is totally different.
Ultimately, the leadership there. I mean, you are a member of the leadership team. Is there a lot of Japanese representation in the leadership team and the management leadership style? You mentioned earlier the consensus style. We talked about that in Sweden. I think you mentioned something more like the boss decides with Toyota. Can you talk a little bit about the decision making processes there?
Yeah, the direction is made by the bosses, and it's something that we called in Japanese. It's called hoshin. Hoshin means direction in Japanese. And in the beginning of the year, the CEO, together with the presidents of the local companies here, they will make a hoshin, which is basically the direction, and they will point out to the company, this is the direction we go. We're gonna do this and this and that. We're going to focus on that, and our focus will be to do this and this and that. And based on that, the Hoshin is cascaded down to the organization. And then my boss will have a Hoshin based on his boss. I will have a Hoshin based on the Hoshin of my boss, and my organization will execute and deliver the Hoshin that we agreed upon. So basically, that's how it works.
Did you find this unusual to adapt to?
I didn't find it very difficult because in the end, the whole company is working towards only one direction. This is the most interesting point of having a whole chain that is cascaded down, and we even use that symbol here because it's like a pyramid. It's cascaded down like that, right? So the whole organization is moving towards the same direction. So uh, you asked if I find it unusual. Of course, I never had to do a Hoshin before. So for me, it was a new thing when I joined the company. But at the same time, I find it very clear in terms of which direction everybody will take, because everything that you do during the year is aligned with the Hoshin. So there is no reason or way to deviate, unless, of course, there are changes in the market situations, and then you have to take decisions because you want to avoid many other shifts that could damage the results of the company. But unless that doesn't happen, everybody agreed on the same direction in the beginning of the year, and everybody will follow that direction.
It sounds like a very consistent approach, and alignment within an organization, of course, is critical for success. And given the scope and the size of Toyota operations in Brazil, the number of people and the number of cars sold, the number of customers, this is very important to get that full alignment.
If we didn't do like this, well, I don't know if we would be able to take care of so many customers, so many cars to sell, organize the whole production. I mean, it's a lot of things. So that's why it's important to have this whole shin, this direction.
So, George, it was really fascinating hearing your journey going from Brazil to Sweden to back to Brazil, to the US, and now also changing really dramatically the cultures within your work, right? Moving to a new company, Toyota, fascinating story, and so much variance, and it really shows your personal adaptability, being able to move and shift successfully between these different types of organizations. I do want to thank you very much for joining us today. And sharing your story with us. And any last words from your side? Any summary that you want to leave? Words of wisdom for the audience?
Thank you, John. Thank you for, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and being able to share all the experience that I had during the last 32, 33 years. And of course, it's very funny going down the memory lane and remembering so many things that were done during those years and even when we worked together, right? If I can give any words of wisdom. And this is basically what I did for the last 33 years is always put your heart in what you do and do the best you can. Because if you work with your heart, with passion for what you do, you will always achieve the best results. And achieving the best results by doing things with passion means you will always go forward, move up, not only as develop as a professional, I mean, in the working environment, but you will also become a better person if you do everything that you can with all your heart. That's it.
Very wise words. I could not agree with you more. Um, very, very meaningful. With that, I would like to thank the audience for joining us on today's podcast of the Auto Ethnographer. We welcome you back for next week's episode. And until then, keep on driving. Thank you for joining us on today's journey. Please remember to like and subscribe to the Auto Ethnographer and leave us a rating or comment. For more information, visit our website at auto-ethnographer.com. You can also follow on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.